Now that the case has been mounted, we're ready to start arranging teeth. There are three types of occlusion we need to consider. One of those is flat plane occlusion, another is lingualized occlusion, and the one that we're going to be arranging this arrangement with is called full cross-arch balanced occlusion. For full cross-arch balanced occlusion, we're going to be using some 33-degree teeth, which means that they have a steep cuspal incline. And because of the steep cuspal incline, we can tolerate a little bit more incisal guidance, or a steeper incisal guidance, than we could of either of the other two types of occlusion. From our protrusive registration, we achieved a horizontal setting for the condyle on the articulator, and on this particular side, which is the patient's right side, that setting is approximately 30 degrees. Consequently, from the protrusive, we found that the patient's condylar slant was about 30 degrees from the horizontal. We look at the other side, and we have slightly more on the other side, a slightly steeper condylar inclination that came from the protrusive registration, and this one's about 33 degrees. From that, using the formula that Rudolph Hanna developed on it, L equals H over 8 plus 12, that gave us the settings for the lateral settings on the condyles, and that turns out to be about 15 degrees on either side. In the arrangement of anterior teeth for a full anatomical cross-arch balanced occlusion, the patient can tolerate a lot more vertical overlap of the anterior teeth than they can if we were using non-anatomical teeth or even lingualized occlusion. So what generally we do in arranging teeth for the full anatomical occlusion is we will arrange the 6 maxillary anterior teeth to what we think is a nice aesthetic arrangement. Then in arranging the mandibular anterior teeth, we will arrange those with a fair amount of vertical overlap to them, and after they're arranged to a point that we think they are very aesthetically acceptable, then we will use the condylar or the incisal table and adjust that in such a way that it protects the anterior teeth as we're arranging the posterior teeth. We've now arranged the 12 anterior teeth into what we consider a nice aesthetic arrangement. What we can do at this point is we can adjust our incisal guide table in such a manner to protect those anterior teeth as we go into protrusive or right or left working relation. So let's loosen the condyles now. Loosen the condyles on the articulator and get them to the point to where they move freely. And let's move the teeth into a straight protrusive, and we see that basically that canine is interfering on that left side when we do that. So in other words, this incisal guide table, as we do that, it has a jump to it. So what we can do is we can raise the incisal guide table by unscrewing that bottom knob at the base of the articulator and then rocking this incisal guide table in such a way that that canine now is just barely hitting high now, so we can raise it a little more if we want to. There we go. And it's just barely grazing it now. So we can lock that in place now, and that's going to protect, from a straight protrusive standpoint, that's going to protect the anterior teeth so that we don't have a bump in the occlusion as the patient goes into protrusive or into right or left lateral. Now let's try the lateral motions, and we'll see that basically we're not in bad shape there. The teeth are just glazing without a bump, and that's with very little incisal guidance to the lateral. Now let's find out what happens on the other side. We come across here and see it has a jump to it. The canines are causing it to jump a bit, so we can raise the wings of the incisal guide table to the point that there's no jump in those canines right there. Now it just barely moves, it's barely touching it, Just a little more. Now, it has free motion without it actually interfering as we go into lateral. So now what we're going to do is start arranging the posterior teeth. And what I'm going to start with would be on the patient's left side. I'm going to arrange two premolars, first and second premolars, on the maxillary left side. I'm going to arrange those at the correct vertical height and also to where they are nice and aesthetic, in that the occlusal plane will follow in with what we started with the anterior teeth, and in addition to that, they will fall into the arch form, so that when we look at this arch form, when we have the posterior teeth in it, as they come along here, the buccal cusp are going to follow the arch form that we've started. So we're just going to remove some wax, enough to accommodate the two premolars in the maxillary left side. And we're going to pull the wax in the area where we would like to place that first premolar. And we get enough wax pulled, get it soft enough, we want to arrange that premolar in such a way that the arch form, when we look at it coming around, the arch form of this buccal cusp continues the arch form that we started with the anterior teeth. We want to arrange it at an occlusal height that's compatible with the canine, and as you can see at this point, that will not close all the way, so we need to raise the tooth slightly from where it is at this point. So we're going to remove the tooth, pull the wax some more. And now let's see if we can get the premolar to go into place in the position where we would like it. Now its vertical height is much more compatible. It's about the same height vertically as the canine. Looking at it from a straight side view like this, we would like the long axis of that premolar to be perfectly vertical, and it appears to be at this point. One other thing that we would like to observe as we're doing this is to look at the height of the lingual cusp, and it should be, for the maxillary first premolar, it should be virtually the same height as the buccal cusp. It appears as though it's a little higher on the lingual cusp than it is on the buccal cusp, so we would like to twist that tooth like that to raise the buccal cusp just slightly so that that lingual cusp will be at the proper height. In order to do that, we're going to have to remove the tooth once again. Pull the wax in that area. See if we can arrange that tooth now in such a way that the buccal cusp and lingual cusp are at about the same height. Lingual cusp appears to be at the same height as the buccal cusp now. Let's look at the arch form. And we come around on the arch form, we see that we have started an arch form with the anterior teeth, and the buccal cusp falls right in alignment with that arch form. The next thing we would like to look at is the long axis of the tooth once again, and looking at the long axis of the tooth, it should be virtually vertical and not tilted this way or this way. And that tooth appears to be virtually in a vertical position, which is where we would like it. So now we're ready to arrange the second premolar. First of all, stabilizing that first premolar that we've arranged by just flowing wax around it. And now let's remove enough wax to accommodate the second premolar that we want to place in there. So we get the second premolar, place it into the arrangement. As we place that tooth, we want to see to it that the long axis turns out about virtually vertical. And what we see when I look at this point, that tooth needs to be raised up just a little bit. It's hanging just a little bit too low. If we look at the plane here, we're about 1 millimeter too low, so that tooth needs to be raised about 1 millimeter. So we'll remove the tooth once again. Base plate, which is a shellac base plate, is interfering with the vertical placement of the tooth. Well, since this shellac is a thermoplastic material, we can take a hot spatula and actually remove some of that material. Now let's see if we can get that premolar to go into place like we wanted it to be. Now, it appears to be on virtually the same height as we come across now as the first premolar. The long axis of the tooth should be vertical, 90-degree angle to the occlusal plane. And now that we're to the second premolar, what we really would like to see is the beginning of a little bit of curvature to our occlusal plane. And we do that by lowering the lingual cusp a little so that that lingual cusp hangs slightly lower than does the buccal cusp. Well, at this point, that's not quite there, in that the lingual cusp needs to come down just a little bit. So let's manipulate it so that the lingual cusp is down just a little. And we can see it's hanging just slightly lower than the buccal cusp. The arch form is beginning to look a little weird because basically this tooth is sitting out just slightly too far. It's out just a little farther than this first premolar. So we want to move that tooth lingually just a little bit. So again, we'll have to remove the tooth. Now that we've removed base plate all the way to cast in that area, we can add a little wax back in. And so what we're going to do is just to get a little piece of wax, put some wax back into that area. Now we'll pool the wax. Now this should give us enough room to be able to manipulate that tooth, get it far enough to the lingual, as far as we'd like it to form the proper arch form. Get the lingual cusp hanging a little lower than the buccal cusp. When we look from the buccal now, we see that this tooth has just a slight mesial inclination to, or distal inclination to it, so I'm just going to move it distally just slightly and try to manipulate that lingual cusp to get it down just a little further than the buccal cusp, just slightly. About like that. From an occlusal aspect to see if the arch form is turning out right. And we see now that this tooth is falling in line with the arch form that we started with the anterior teeth and continuing through the premolar region. So let's stabilize it by just flowing some wax around it, melting the wax that's around it and letting it flow up against the tooth real well. And now that we have that stabilized, we're going to make sure we have no wax left on the occlusal surface of those two posterior teeth, because that's what's going to determine the position of a lower second premolar. Now what we want to do is we want to arrange a mandibular for second premolar now so that the cusp tip, the buccal cusp tip of that mandibular second premolar fits right into the fossa formed by these two teeth right there. So we're going to take some wax off of this lower, and we're going to arrange a mandibular first premolar now, or second premolar, so that it articulates properly with the maxillary two premolars that we have already arranged. We're going to attempt to arrange that mandibular second premolar in such a way that it articulates in centric relation with the maxillary two premolars that have already been arranged. Start preliminarily putting the mandibular second premolar in place. And now we're going to close the articulator and see that that tooth is a little bit too far to the mesial. So we want to move it distally a little bit now. It appears as though we have the correct mesiodistal position for that tooth at this point, but we do not have the cusp articulating properly yet. So what we're going to do is to remove enough wax so we can see this well. And we'll see that anterior posteriorly this tooth is beginning to look pretty good. It's fitting in the cusp tip of the mandibular is fitting right in the embrasure formed by the maxillary first and second premolars. Now the only problem that we have with this now is that those lingual cusp of that mandibular second premolar are setting much too low. So we have to rotate that tooth enough now to raise the lingual cusp up to approximately the same plane as the buccal cusp. In order to do that, we're going to have to put the gingival part of this mandibular second premolar farther lingual, and that will rotate the tooth to get the lingual cusp up into its proper occlusion. So what we'll do, we will remove that mandibular second premolar, pull the wax more, get the wax soft enough to where we can play with that tooth a little bit better. Now let's place the tooth back in again. Too far to the distal, so we want to bring it forward a little now. It's getting close. So we close it in centric relation, and we see that the buccal cusp tip is fitting right into that embrasure as it should. Now let's put it in working relation, and what we should see is that the mesial slope of the mandibular second premolar is occluding in working relation now with the distal slope of the maxillary first premolar. And the distal slope of the mandibular second premolar is now occluding with the mesial slope of the maxillary second premolar. That's in working relation, like this. If we bring it into balancing or non-working relation, we should begin to get some contacts there, and that's what we're not getting at this point. We're slightly off. Okay, so we need to play with this tooth just a little more, raising it up just a bit, and see if when we place it in centric relation, it works fine. In working relation, it's working fine. And we're closer in our lateral relation, but it's still missing by 1/2 millimeter. It means that that tooth is probably a little bit too far to the buccal. Let's see what's happening now. Now, there we go. Now, we're still maintaining that relationship of the slopes of the mandibular with the slopes of the maxillary, and we're much, much closer on balancing relation now. It's within about 1/4 millimeter, it appears. It's getting very close. So let's see if we manipulate it just a tad more, what happens here. I like the relationship when we go into working this way, but in non-working, it's just a tad off. So let's see what happens if we go to the maxillary now, and we're going to lower this buccal cusp of the maxillary just a little bit. Now it's much closer. Now from there, we have found the anterior-posterior position of a mandibular second premolar in relation to where a good aesthetic arrangement of the maxillary first and second premolars would be. This allows us now to finish our setup out with proper cusp fossa relationships of the mandibular teeth to the maxillary teeth. So what we will be doing from here, we'll be finishing out, since we know the position now of the mandibular second premolar, we can finish out our mandibular arch as far as this quadrant is concerned. We can place the first premolar and 2 molars in here into the position we think they should be, and then we can arrange the rest of the maxillary teeth to occlude properly with them. First and second premolars, that's given us the position where the mandibular second premolar should go, so we have a good idea now about the mesiodistal positioning of all of the mandibular teeth. And when that mandibular second premolar is in its correct position, if we can see in centric relation that we have a good solid cusp fossa relationship of the mandibular buccal cusp into the fossa created by the triangular fossa of the maxillary 2 premolars. When we move the mandible into left working position, as we're doing here, we'll see that we can maintain contact of the mesial slope of the mandibular second premolar with the distal slope of the maxillary first premolar, and we also at the same time have contact of the distal slope of the mandibular second premolar with the mesial slope of the maxillary second premolar. At the same time that we're having that contact, we must also note that when we move the articulator into balancing side, or the non-working side, we are maintaining contact of the maxillary lingual cusp of the maxillary first premolar with the buccal cusp of the mandibular second premolar. So we actually have, with those teeth now, with those 3 teeth, we have begun to create a cross-arch balance. I'm going to remove some wax now from the area where these molars belong. And place the tooth now with the central groove over the crest of the ridge. We want to make sure that this marginal ridge is level with the distal marginal ridge of the second premolar, and at this point it is. At the same time that we're doing this, we want to analyze our occlusal plane, in that we would like that occlusal plane to end up somewhere about halfway or 2/3 of the way up the retromolar pad. So that appears as though that's in pretty good shape. It's starting that, and if we look at it from the side, we can see that when we start with the canine tip, as we come back through the molar, that this begins to form a little curve, in that if we were setting these strictly flat, then this cusp would be at the same height as this cusp. But this cusp needs to be just a little bit higher so that we start creating that curvature in an anterior-posterior direction. We also need, as we do that, to make sure that the lingual cusp is slightly lower than the buccal cusp, so that we start creating a curvature in a buccolingual direction. It appears to be just slightly too far depressed on the lingual, so I'll raise that just a little bit, and that should give us now the beginning of a nice curvature that is going to extend from the canine tip through the second molar after the second molar has been properly placed. We're going to now place this second molar on the setup. And so we pull the wax again. The wax nice and soft, so we won't have any problem placing the tooth. And we take our second molar now, and we're going to make sure as we arrange that tooth that the marginal ridge of this second molar is going to be even with the distal marginal ridge of the first molar, which means it needs to be down just a little bit there. And we can see when we look at this, we're beginning to form now a curvature that is both buccolingually this way, but we're beginning to form a curvature this way, in that these cusps should be a little higher than these cusps. I think that we need to raise that second molar on the distal just a little. And when we have the tooth filled in here in the space that we have created here, we can see we should have a nice curvature starting from the tip of the canine through all of these teeth and curving up, with the plane ending up about 2/3 up the retromolar pad. So let's stabilize those teeth now. We'll do that by just melting the wax around them and letting that wax stabilize the teeth. We'll get rid of the extra wax that's there, just to keep it neat. On the lingual, we need to stabilize it because we have a little space between that second molar and the wax, so we want to flow wax into that so that it's held, the tooth is held nicely in place with the wax after the wax is hardened. That's doing pretty good now. We have a little excess wax here on the lingual, which we can get rid of, and just smooth the wax out. Remember now, the compensating curvature, which is what we're dealing with, is a combination of the curve of von Spee, or as we Americanized it and called it, the curve of Spee, which is an anterior-posterior curve, and the curve of Wilson, which is a lateral to medial curve. And that means that the lingual cusp of these posteriors, through the molars in particular, will be slightly depressed from the buccal cusp. And when we look at it from a lateral view, we have a curvature of all the cusp tips of these buccal cusp tips. Should be a nice even curvature from the canine tip through the distal of the second molar. Now that the mandibular molars are in place, we're ready at this point to remove wax in the area where we would like our maxillary molars to be arranged. We're going to place the maxillary first molar in such a position that it meets Angle's classification 1 of occlusion, meaning that the mesiobuccal cusp of a maxillary first molar should align with the buccal groove of the mandibular first molar. So we're going to pool some wax. And now we're going to place that maxillary molar. And the way I like to do this is to more or less mash those teeth into place. And we do that, but once we have the wax soft enough to be able to manipulate the teeth well, what we're going to do is we're going to hold the maxillary molar to keep it from sliding buccally on us and close the articulator into full occlusion, and let that dictate the position then of where that maxillary molar is going to be. And hopefully we have enough room and don't have to end up having to grind on the tooth, but let's see. Now as we close it, we want to make sure it's in centric relation, and we're going to close the articulator and mash it into place in centric relation. Then we're going to move it over into working relation, mash it into place, back in centric relation again, and then over into non-working or balancing relation. And we're getting pretty good, except we're just a little high with that distal buccal cusp of the maxillary second premolar, and I can see why that is happening. That's happening because if we will look at the long axis now of this tooth, to vertical or 90-degree angle to your occlusal plane, this tooth, the second premolar, is a little bit tilted mesially like this, which lowers this contact, this slope of the buccal cusp, the distal slope of the buccal cusp. It lowers it. And as you can see, that's where our interference is at this point. So what we need to do is to work just a little bit on this maxillary second premolar, and we're going to do that by softening the wax around it a bit. And try to straighten the long axis of that tooth up to give it more of a vertical long axis to it rather than it having a mesial inclination to it. On it, you can take a knife and just literally move the tooth a little bit, a hard instrument, and move it just a little bit. Now let's see what it does for us. If we close this into centric relation, that's looking pretty good now. As we can see, we have good cusp-fossa relationships of virtually every tooth in working relation and in balancing relation. That's first molar. I like that, where that position is at this. Now we're going to stabilize those teeth by melting the wax around them. And we need to do that palatally as well as on the buccal. Make sure that we have no wax left on the occlusal surfaces of any of the teeth. A little bit right there. And no wax down here. And now we have the maxillary first molar in place. With good working contacts and good balancing contacts. It should also exhibit good protrusive contacts, which it does. Very nice. Now, our next tooth to arrange will be the maxillary second molar, much in the same manner that we arranged the maxillary first molar, trying to maintain good working contacts, good balancing contacts, and good protrusive contacts. So now we're going to place that maxillary second molar and as you can see, we got some wax in the occlusal, which will hinder the arrangement of the tooth, the proper arrangement of the tooth. So we'll clean it up a little bit. And I will need to take that out and soften the wax again now, because in the process of doing that, that wax got a little bit too hard for us, so we're going to soften the wax and arrange that maxillary second molar into proper occlusion. Now, as we did with the first molar, we're going to close it in centric relation, move it into working relation, and move it back into balancing relation, and we have pretty good contacts of everything with it like that. I'm well pleased with that. So now we're going to stabilize those teeth. After stabilizing it, we check it once again just to make sure we're doing pretty good on contacts. I like that. What we need to do now is to try that first premolar into the space and see if it's going to be the correct dimension. And we see when we try that onto that area, it's a little bit too wide mesiodistally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim that tooth on the proximals of it. So we'll grind some on the mesial, and then we'll turn it over and grind some on the distal of it. And now we'll try it into the space once again and see if that looks like that's going to be the correct space for us. Now it appears as though that tooth will fit the space okay. By hollow grinding it, on both the mesial and the distal of the tooth. Arrange this first premolar in such a way that it will be a good aesthetic value to it. We don't end up with it looking too crowded or looking as though there are spaces there. The tooth is just a little bit too high at this point, and I think I need to grind just a little bit more on that tooth in order to get it to fit in there properly. Now that should fit into that space without a problem. Now we have the wax pool, and we just arrange the tooth for aesthetics so that basically the cusp height falls into the curvature that we started with it. And since that is a first premolar, we do not expect much of function out of that tooth. We're primarily concerned of aesthetics with it. And that's in pretty good shape now. Stabilize the tooth by flowing the wax around it and smoothing it out. And now we have the teeth arranged for the left side of this particular case into nice group function of all of the slopes of the cusp and cusp tips in proper position, and we have nice group function with it, and we put it into non-working. We have nice balancing contacts on each and every tooth from the first molar all the way through the second molar. So from here, we will be ready to arrange all of the teeth on the patient's right side, and then we should have a good cross-arch balanced occlusion. Now that we have all of the posterior teeth arranged, we can see that when we open the articulator a little bit, the posterior teeth are set into a curvature. That's a buccal lingual curvature or a curve of Wilson, and an anterior posterior curvature, which is commonly known as the curve of Spee. When we close the articulator with a good cross-arch balanced occlusion, we should see that when we go into working relationship, that the cusp tips all contact, or the contact of the cusp slopes of the maxillary teeth contact the cusp slopes of the mandibular teeth in working relation. And we come around to the opposing side, to the patient's right side, and we see we have the same thing. Now this is set into an Angles Class 1 classification of occlusion, in that if we look at the maxillary first molar, the buccal cusp of the maxillary first molar, the mesial buccal cusp of the maxillary first molar, aligns properly with the buccal groove of the mandibular first molar. And when we place it into working relation, we have good contacts of all of those slopes. We also can, when we go into working relation on the opposite side, we can observe that we have lingual contacts of all of the maxillary posterior lingual cusp with the mandibular buccal cusp. And the same is true on the other side. When we move it into right working relation, we'll see that on the opposing side we have lingual cusp of the maxillary contacting the buccal cusp of the lower, thus giving you balanced occlusion, bilateral balance. If we turn it around and look at the linguals now, we should see the same things occurring, in that when we put it into working relation, let's say on the left side, and we put it into working relation, we should see that those cusp tips of the lingual cusp of the maxillary are all contacting the lingual cusp of the mandibular. When we move it into balancing relation, we can also see that the lingual cusp of the upper maintain contacts with the buccal cusp of the mandibular. The same is true on the other side. If we put it into working relation, we have contacts of the maxillary lingual cusp of the mandibular lingual cusp. If we put it into non-working relation, the balancing side, we should have contacts of the lingual cusp of the maxillary posterior teeth with the buccal cusp of the mandibular posterior teeth. In addition to this, that if we turn it around and look at what happens when we put it into straight protrusive, we also are maintaining protrusive balance in that the buccal cusp of the maxillary posterior teeth, when we go into protrusion, maintain contacts with the buccal cusp of the mandibular posterior teeth. Hence, this is what's called a cross-arch balanced occlusion. As we can see, this is a little more difficult to do than the other two types of occlusion that we've discussed, such as lingualized or flat plane occlusion. It can give a very nice aesthetic result, and this type of occlusion we use primarily on patients with fairly good ridges and fairly young and well muscularly coordinated. And those types of patients appreciate this type of occlusion.